Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 67 of I Wish You Were Dead, a podcast about things that used to be alive. My name is Mike, and that is Gavin. And Gavin, we have some news for the podcast.
We sure do. So, if you remember, all the way back to episode 34, we featured best good friend of the pod, Fia Campanino. Fia, say hi.
Hello, everybody.
So, we have been talking with Fia a whole bunch, and she wants to get into doing some more science communication type things. And Mike and I discussed, and we thought it'd be a good idea for Fia to join as a third host to the podcast. So, this is our first episode with that going forward. This is going to be how it's going to be, going forward. We've sort of just talked loosely amongst ourselves. If we do like guest episodes, it might be fewer of us just because 3 people all talking at a guest might be a lot. But we're really excited. And in addition to adding Fia as a co-host, we're adding a new segment as well, similar to Today in History with Mike. At the end of each episode, we're going to have Swamp Corner with Fia, which we will explain why Swamp Corner when that time comes. But yeah, Mike and I are really excited to have Fia on and start a new sort of era of the podcast.
Yeah, I mean, like Fia's kind of awesome. So if you guys aren't a huge fan of this, suck it, because we don't really care.
Mike.
Because Fia's the co-host, and
she is.
Thanks, Mike.
That's the way it's going to be. So, I mean, if Fia's willing to put up with me making ridiculous jokes, and then she was like, "No, yeah, I want to be part of that." Yeah. Honestly, I'm in. So this is what we're doing now. I hope you guys are looking forward to it, and hopefully next episode, actually, we're gonna have a little mini episode where we get to know Fia a little bit better. But just to begin with here, Fia's going to jump right in as one of our regular co-hosts here on episode 67. So, Fia, welcome to the pod, and hopefully you stick around.
Yeah, thanks so much for the warm welcome, guys. I'm very excited to be here.
Of course, buddy. So, shifting topics entirely to the topic of this episode, today we are talking about the Blessed Nicolas Steno, widely considered one of the founders of geology and one of the most important figures that like you learn about him in like lecture like 2 or 3 of like Geology 101. He's like the guy that you first learn about when you learn about like the very basics of modern geology. But he wasn't just important in geology. He was important in a lot of fields, including like anatomy, and also did quite a lot with the church at the time. So we will be talking about that. But before we get too far into the weeds on him, Mike, do you have a Today in History for us?
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure if the website I'm looking at, if just March 23rd is the most boring day in history, or if there wasn't much happening. But there wasn't too much to pick from here. Luckily, I do have something.
Okay.
For this. So in 1775, does anybody know why that year might be relevant?
No idea.
I mean, American Revolution things.
Gavin, you are pretty close. So
okay.
1775, that's when the American Revolution begins, and the year after actually is when the Declaration of Independence gets signed. But in 1775 is when the fighting begins, and a man named Patrick Henry gives a famous quote. Do you remember what that quote will be?
Was that... No, I do not. I thought I had it, but...
Fia, any guess?
I am lost.
In 1775, Patrick Henry gives that famous quote, "Give me liberty or give me death."
Okay, I don't know. That came to my mind, but in my mind, for some reason, I'm like, nah, that was Ben Franklin.
I thought that too.
No idea why.
It is always a good idea to just assume that Ben Franklin said or probably said any quote that you're thinking of. But no, in 1775, Patrick Henry gave that quote that helped to inspire the young little United States. Cool. And beyond that, I've got things that happened on this day. There's like something about the Communist Party in the Soviet Union, Hitler, World War II, and something in Syria. So
it doesn't sound as much boring as it does horrible.
Yeah, kind of.
Yeah.
I mean, something about Jewish religious law as well back in 1490. So
In 1490. Wow. Okay, we're
Yeah,
going back in time pretty far in this episode, but not quite that far.
not quite that far. So yeah, that's what I got for today. Nice, short, sweet. Patrick
Cool.
Henry said a thing. Moving on. Gavin, who's
Very cool.
who's this jabroni here?
So, Nicolas Steno, or as he was born, Niels Steensen, which was later Latinized.
That's the name of a guy that would get shoved into a locker. I swear. Niels Steensen. If that dude was around in an 80s movie, like he's around in the first 5 minutes of the movie to get picked on and then never seen again because he died in that locker.
Poor guy.
So his name is typically Latinized to Nicolas Steno, or sometimes you might see it Nicolaus Steno or Stenonius. Latin's weird. So he was born in January of 1638 and died in December of 1686. So he was 48 years old when he died. So we're going back in time quite a ways. Not as far back as we sometimes do on this podcast, but in terms of
yeah, good. Like I feel like in the 1600s,
like for the time.
Yeah, like not many people live that long. Is that a good age to die?
I can actually speak a little bit to this.
Oh, okay, go ahead.
So the general idea when you look back in time and you see like the average age of a person is like 30 years or something back then. That's because the child mortality rate was so high. Like you were way more likely to die if you were an infant or 2 years old, and that would bring down the average. Once you made it to about age 15 or so, you could be expected to live, what we would consider today a reasonably long life of 60, 70, possibly 80 years. So this is a little bit younger than what you might expect for somebody that lived to the age of 15, 20 and then did not make it into their 50s. This is a little bit younger than you might expect.
Although to be fair, the death or the mortality rate at this time was much higher because in the 1650s there was a pretty big bout of plague. So weirdly that wasn't mentioned all that much. Granted, he lived 30 years after that, but it was mentioned that it killed a decent amount of people at the school he was at the time. But anywho, so weirdly, and something that I didn't ever think about but makes sense is that depending on what source you look at, he was either born on January 1st or January 11th, and that is because he was born in Denmark, and at the time Denmark had not updated to the modern calendar system that we currently use. They were still on, I think, the Julius calendar or Julian calendar.
Right.
So depending on what source you look at, he may have been born or died on different days, but technically they're the same day. It's weird.
You will find a similar thing with a lot of American founding fathers, where you will say their birth date in old style versus new style, because that's about when the British colonies, in the 1700s, wind up switching their calendars. Okay. So people born around this time, the dates of their birth and death can be off by a week and a half or so, I believe.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's something that I had just never thought about it, but I'm like, it makes sense. Different, peoples all over the world have used different calendars, but so Steno was a Danish man, so a man of Denmark, of many talents, who was a part-time bishop in his later years. More on that later. A quick list of some of his contributions, mainly to geology, before we get into some of his biography stuff, because this is why he's important to me and why we learn about him. So Steno, like a lot of early scientists of his time and a little later, pointed at things and described them that we now would say, oh, that's just common sense. But until the first person explains it, it's not common, Right. So a lot of these rules, particularly the geology ones, might seem obvious, but until somebody thought to write them down, they weren't part of science. So Steno's main principles, in my opinion as a geologist, are what are called Steno's principles. And so they are 4 rules that are sort of the governing laws of especially sedimentary geology. So rocks made out of different particles of things instead of by volcanoes or by like mountain buildings. So stuff made out of sand and sand-like things. So the first one is the law of superposition, which basically means that the rocks on top are younger than the rocks at the bottom. Basically, rocks are laid down in layers one on top of another and not built from the bottom up. Which again, today makes sense, but at the time, people had no idea how rocks formed at all. They thought that the environment was a pretty much immutable thing that, particularly at this time, was just made by God the way it is. The second one is the law of original horizontality, which is exactly what it sounds like. Sedimentary rocks are always deposited horizontally as if they were a fluid, which can be a little hard to visualize, like sand particles being like a liquid or a fluid. But so basically, if you take like a valley, especially like an underwater valley, and you just fill it with sediment, the top layer of that sediment is always going to be horizontal. Basically, this law says if you find some sedimentary rocks that are not completely horizontal, something has happened. A mountain building event, erosion, or some kind of thing disturbed the rocks. These rocks need more context than just what they show at face value, essentially. The third one is the law of cross-cutting relationships, which basically says if one rock feature cuts across another, it must be younger than the original feature. Basically, if you... there are things in geology called dikes and sills. Basically, it's when magma comes up, not through a volcano, but just through a random vent. It sort of plows itself a path up through some other rocks to just sort of seep out from the ground in a place that's not like a volcano that you would normally think of. And so when those solidify and harden, those cut across the rocks that they plowed through. Basically, in order to cut through a rock, that rock needs to be there in the first place. So that dike or sill cut through the rock after the rock was deposited.
So this is just like timeline stuff. We got to get the order of operations here.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And again, it kind of makes sense. If you cut a cake, the cake has to be there for you to cut it. Exact same thought process. But again, until somebody
Rocks
points
just
it
don't
out.
fall right out of the sky.
Exactly. Although that was, I don't actually have it in my notes, but that was actually a thing about how certain rocks actually got here, particularly fossils. I think that was something from like a Roman scholar. I think it was like Pliny the Elder, I think, proposed that fossils wound up inside of rocks because they fell from the moon and like hit so hard that they just like embedded themselves in rocks.
Mm-hmm.
Nice.
I mean, when you're in the Roman times, that's all you got to work with.
Right.
So those are the main three, but there is another one that is talked about a little less, because I had always learned it as like the main three, but apparently he had a fourth as well. It is the law of lateral continuity, and this one's hard to explain just with words. So if you imagine like the Grand Canyon, where it's just a big chasm with rocks on either side, basically, if there is a 10-foot red layer at this height on one side and a 10-foot red layer on the other side at the same height, you can assume that those were once connected.
Is that like, that has to be the case, or you can just assume and you'll probably be right?
Right. I think, especially in the case of something like the Grand Canyon, where it is that close together. Like the Grand Canyon is, pretty wide, but not that wide. But in that case specifically, yeah, that's pretty much a given. Okay. In some cases, it could be like across an entire valley. Valleys are very big here in California. Or in central New York as well, those big glacial valleys. So if you see on one side, this band of, say a foot thick shale on one side, and there's a foot thick shale on the other side, they've got the same fossils, they're, the same sediment descriptions and everything, you can assume that they were probably once connected at some point.
Okay.
So those are, again, things that are a little conceptual, but seem a little basic, and that's why we talk about them in like Geology 101. But until Steno came along and published these and wrote these down, we had no idea how sedimentary rocks worked. No idea. There were people who had been working on stuff, but never really hit quite as close to our modern understanding as Steno did. So that's the big reason why Steno is so famous among geologists today. And he was really the first person to hit on this kind of thing and would basically inspire all of the major developments in the next, 100, 200 years of like early like Enlightenment scientists doing all the good work in geology to make geology what it is today. So Steno really laid the bedrock, pun intended, of modern geology. So with that out of the way about why we're actually talking about this guy, let's actually talk about his life and some stuff that he did. So he was born in Copenhagen, Denmark in 1638. And his dad was a goldsmith who regularly made gold things for the king of Denmark at the time. So his family was doing pretty well. Unfortunately, Steno got really, really sick, and I tried to look up like what he actually got sick with, and I couldn't really find a solid answer. But when he was 3, so in 1641, he got really sick and had to be isolated for like years. So I don't know if it was some kind of like immune thing. I really don't know, but he had to be isolated for quite a while, and that like shaped a lot of his like childhood. And then most things that I read just kind of were like, yeah, then the 1650s happened. That's when the plague stuff happened. So it's like, life in Northern Europe was just not good.
Generally not noted for being a great time on that continent.
Right, and it's like this wasn't like the big plague. I think that was in like the 1300s, but plague even still exists today. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So in the late 1650s, Steno attended the University of Copenhagen and studied medicine, actually, which is weird that a lot of people who end up doing a lot of things in science usually start out studying medicine. Like I believe Darwin's initial intention was to study medicine. So, medicine's like, I guess pretty popular. So after that, he traveled Europe as rich people are wont to do. And basically, as he just sort of traveled around Europe, he just sort of, bumped elbows and met all sorts of the top scientists in France, Italy, Germany, Netherlands, and became really well known for his observational skills, which, as scientists, that's like the most important part of being a scientist is your ability to observe things and then document them. And so as he sort of traveled around Europe, he kind of, from what I was able to find, kind of made a reputation for himself as the kind of guy who would just kind of show up, express doubt on the thing you've been working on for a long time, be right, and then leave.
I mean, that's the worst part. That guy shows up and they're correct.
Yeah. So, for example, there's another famous scientist, I think his first name is Rene, but most people know him as Descartes. So he's much more famous for his contributions to math, but for whatever reason, he was working on the source of tears. I guess they didn't know that at the time. And so Descartes thought that they came from the brain, which kind of seems like an obvious thing. The brain's right there. It's full of fluid. Maybe.
I mean, if you didn't know what you were talking about, that would seem reasonable.
I can see the leap.
Right.
But Steno didn't really give an alternative to that case specifically, but he was like, nah. And apparently Descartes did not like that. So his first sort of claim to fame was he discovered the Parotid Duct, which particularly in mammals, I don't know if it's the exact same duct in reptiles, amphibians, and fish and stuff, but it's basically the duct that carries saliva from your salivary gland to your mouth. He actually discovered that duct. And that's what he, did his dissertation on. So he discovered it in, I think, rabbits. I think I saw pigs as well. It's actually named after him. I think it's called all pieces of anatomy have like a technical Latin name, and I think that one is Ductus stenonius. So there you go. But shortly after that, he also did a lot of other things with anatomy. For a while, people didn't really believe they didn't know what the heart was really made out of. Certain other scientists at the time thought it was how the body generated its heat, which, as we know, is not really the case today. It's a very complex metabolic thing that I don't fully understand. I'll learn about it at some point. But but no, so Steno was pretty much just like, yeah, it's just another muscle, guys. It's like, it's a little more complicated than that, but yeah, your heart is just a muscle. But Steno was pretty much the first one to be like, yeah, it's just a muscle, guys. I don't know why.
And what year was this?
This was still in this would be like early 1660s.
So I just want to make sure I understand. So we're talking about this guy who was saying all this stuff in the 1600s, and he was basically right about this stuff. Like this isn't like that kid from the Polar Express showing up as being wrong about everything, really annoyingly. Like this is
as far as I know, no. Most of the things, granted, you get famous for the things you get right. So sure. I'm positive that he got things wrong. Like even like the Steno's principles weren't fully right. Just as we now understand them, there are some asterisks and things, but that's sort of what we've talked about before, where it's like a systematic refutation of lies, where it's like the Stenos are what you teach the 101 students, so that when they get to 301, you can wind it back a little bit and be like, okay, that's broadly true, but here are the exceptions that you need to know about to be a good geologist. So,
right.
So he was definitely wrong about a couple of things, but those incorrect things don't usually make it into the biographies. And lastly, of his major biological things that he discovered was the lateral line system in fish. He was the first one to describe that. That is
that's pretty cool.
Yeah. So actually, Fia, you work with marine stuff. What does the lateral line do?
Oh man, don't ask me that question.
No, you work with inverts, so it's okay.
I'm inverts.
So it's exactly what it sounds like on either.
Fia, I can't believe you don't know that.
I'm sorry.
On either side of a fish, they're called lateral lines. So on the sides, it's just a line down the body, and there's a whole bunch of. It gets like much more complicated than just a line, especially on the face. But for most of the body, it's just a line. But that's how they detect vibrations in the water. So that's why, if fish,
I feel like I did know that.
They don't really have like ears per se. They have a couple bones that would, once fish evolved to come onto land, would become related to hearing and stuff, but they don't have ears in the way that you and I do. So they detect vibrations in the water through this line system, and it's incredibly precise. And he was the first one to really document that and publish on it. So he was doing stuff all over the place, mostly with vertebrates, sadly. In 1666, he accepted a position as a professor of anatomy at the University of Padua in Italy, and quickly moved on to become the personal physician for the Grand Duke of Tuscany. So
Grand Duke of Tuscany. Wait, what is the Grand Duke of Tuscany? That sounds amazing.
It's probably just like a noble family. So Tuscany is in Italy, as is Padua. So he was doing stuff in Italy at this time. But yeah, so just like a noble person, likely the people under the people in charge. I don't know exactly what was going on geopolitics wise in the 1600s. I think it was. Right. I don't know if that was Holy Roman Empire times or not. I don't remember.
That is well outside of my field of expertise, so I have no idea.
But he was doing stuff in Italy, and so as I said, he started doing this one thing in Padua in 1666, and then very quickly after just moved on to something else. That's a big theme with Steno. He never really stayed in one spot for very long. He just kind of bounced around and did stuff. But the Grand Duke of Tuscany and their general family become pretty important in Steno's life. They're big supporters of his throughout his entire life. They pay for a lot of his science experiments. They pay for a lot of his lodging and things, and then they sort of come around again at the end of his life. But while he was working for the Grand Duke and his family, he was sent the head of I didn't find a species that this was attributed to, but the head of just some gigantic shark. not like a megalodon big, but probably like
Big
a big Mediterranean shark. Yeah, so he got sent this head, and he dissected it, as scientists do, and he noticed how similar the teeth of this shark were to some features that had been found in rocks by some other scientists that other scientists had been calling tungstones.
Do you know why they were calling them tungstones?
Apparently, because they look like tongues. Apparently, it's that simple.
All right.
I don't get
I love
it.
how
But,
this makes sense.
right, but spoilers, they're fossil shark teeth. And so, at the time, the main thought was that fossils actually grew naturally within the rocks. That they were just a part of nature. That's like, oh, the rock is weird at this part in the middle. Because, just to put this in context, extinction, just like as a concept that people understood that animals went extinct, that as a concept would not be a thing for like the next 150 years.
Wow.
So like
Just the concept of extinction, you said?
yes.
Really?
Yeah. That was a thing that came around
okay.
in like the late 1700s.
How this might be too much of a rabbit hole to go down, but how did that come about? Was like a species observed to go extinct, or just did the idea, like somebody put the idea down on paper somewhere?
Yeah, that's a bit too much of a digression, but generally it was they kept finding fossils and they're like, we definitely don't have this around today. So they're like, well, it must not be here anymore. So that's pretty much how it happened. With a lot more steps, but
Yeah.
but yeah, so it's like them thinking that was like, well, it's in the rock. It must just grow there. You know, crystals, especially at this time, were thought to have just done the same as well. It's just this big crystal inside a rock. It just grew there, which like isn't technically wrong for crystals, but they were like, well, if crystals do it, why can't this weird thing? And so because they thought it was a feature of the rock, they didn't really make the comparison to any modern, like an animal, you know? And so another researcher had actually even published some evidence on these tungstones being organic in nature, apparently by burning them, which I don't get because fossils generally aren't flammable unless it's stuff like coal.
I mean, is it organic matter?
Well, it's teeth. So teeth are not really organic in nature anyway.
Right. Yeah.
So that was what I kept seeing in a couple sources. I'm like, I don't know how that would tell you, but sure.
Yeah.
But yeah, so some other guy in 1616, so like 50 years before Steno was doing this kind of stuff, suggested that these were organic, but nobody really took him seriously at the time. And Steno basically saw that guy stuff, and he kind of extended on it, and he suggested that the chemical composition of fossils could change without their shape changing. Basically what we would call today as fossilization. He didn't call it that, but he basically was the first one to sort of be like, It was the first one that sort of made a big impact. I saw reports of some guy from like the 9th century, so like the thousands, some like, I think he was Chinese, suggesting that. I'm like, that was really impressive. That was not the date range that I thought it was going to say. But he was the first like major well-known European scientist to suggest that fossils were probably organic. So again, just really, really living it up here. And this the whole work with fossils, and it's like, well, if this thing didn't grow here, if this is organic, how did it get there? And trying to think of how this fossil ended up in this rock led him to come up with his principles of geology. And so he published that book with the principles in 1669. And in that book, he also talked about other things, how crystals wound up in rocks too. And apparently that laid the groundwork for all the studies of minerals and crystals as we have them today. Basically, his main thing was, so crystals of the same mineral will reliably grow the same crystal shape. And that's a major thing with minerals today. A lot of how you identify minerals is their shape.
Yeah.
So he was, again, the first one to kind of just write that down. sometimes science really is that easy. And
He
then
doesn't have like a fancy law name for it. I feel like all the other ones were fancy.
no, that one I think did, but I didn't write it down.
Oh. I really appreciate that about him, that he has these fancy names for very simple concepts.
Right. Well, it's like, especially at the time, this was, groundbreaking stuff. Why wouldn't you give it a fancy name? I definitely would have.
Right. Yeah.
And then the next year, I'm sorry, I'm jumping forward a little bit. So he published that book in 1669. Rewinding back a little bit. So a couple years before that, so in 1667, he converted to Lutheran or from Lutheranism to Catholicism.
Whoa.
And yeah, the reason that I was able to find was basically that he, obviously being such, an impressive scientist, he's very curious. And I guess the like complexities of Catholicism just, his curiousness was more satisfied by Catholicism than by Lutheranism. That was the best explanation I could really find, other than he spent a lot of time in Italy, so...
I have a similar story, except for Catholicism was the one I didn't get satisfaction out of as a kid.
Nice.
Yeah. But, so, yeah, that was in 1667, and then in 1671, he ended up moving back up north to Copenhagen to teach at the university there. And then a couple years later, he decided to become much more involved with the church than he had been. So in 1675, he became an ordained priest after only like 4 months of like work to do it.
That seems fast. I mean, I don't know.
That's a big thing that I noticed with Steno church stuff, was he moved real fast. Much faster than I think definitely would be possible today. He also became an ordained priest after only a couple months, and he became very involved in sort of the like counter Reformation movement, because around this time, the Reformation stuff and the Protestant stuff was becoming much more popular, and obviously the Catholic Church did not like that. So he was very involved in convincing people to be Catholics and not Protestants. And within like 2 years, I think it was a little less than 2.5 years, he became a bishop.
Wow.
So
this guy's moving through ranks.
Right. So like I said, in 75, he became a priest. And then I think that was in April. And I think in September of 77, he became a bishop and was sent north to Catholicize the mostly Protestant countries of Northern Europe. And he gets significantly less cool after this. So he was very likely involved in like the banning of a lot of publications by some of like the early Enlightenment like philosophers, like very publicly as well. Like it's pretty well documented. Man. Yeah. So obviously, as unfortunately topical as this is, banning books is generally not great.
Right. You're usually on the wrong side of history when you do that.
Yeah. So a real ding on Steno's reputation here.
I also have a hard time grasping how he is a scientist, but then also very religious. And I thought at that time those two things were conflicting.
I think it depends. I think they probably, and maybe that's why they were raising him through the ranks so much, so they could keep a closer eye on him.
Oh.
Again, that's just pure speculation off the top of my head right there. But I think a lot of it would come from, if people were saying, like, questioning that things were like the way God put them, that was bad. But if he's just trying to explain what's going on, because I know a lot of other, particularly like 1700s people, would phrase things as like they were trying to discover the ways that God shaped the earth, more or less.
Oh,
and that's how they kind of skirted around getting in trouble with the church.
Got it.
Again, that's all speculation. I didn't really find anything either way on that. So, but apparently, despite him helping, ban a bunch of publication stuff, apparently he was very, very altruistic, as one would hope a high-ranking church official would be. Apparently he sold off a lot of like the really nice like bishops like gold stuff that you kind of just get if you're a bishop to help like feed needy people where he was. So
Good
that's
for him.
cool, I guess. Good job, Steno. So that was in like I said, 77 is when he became a bishop, and then in 1680 he became the auxiliary bishop of Munster. So this was now in Germany, and resigned from that position in 1683 over internal church politics.
Oh dear.
Mostly that, like, I guess I have no idea how things are done in the Catholic Church. I don't. And so I think there was like an election for a bishop that like I don't believe he was like even like in the running for, but he didn't like the results or didn't believe the results, and they were like, well, this is how it is, and then he left. So
Drama.
yeah, so then he was like, all right, I'm out. I'm gonna leave and go back to science and study brains now. That's exactly what
He's
he
so
did.
random.
Yeah.
He's like, I'll just do whatever I feel like.
And so he just sort of spent the next little while wandering around Northern Europe, which still, despite his efforts to Catholicize it, was still largely Protestant. But he made a reputation for himself for being very counter-reform, and he was not welcome in a lot of places. And so he kind of spent a little bit of time in various cities in Germany, and essentially he basically lived like he was poor. Whether he was or not, I don't really know. I don't know if you have to give up all your money, because like I said, he came from money, so I don't know if he had to give all that up to become a priest. I don't know. But yeah, so for about 2 years, he apparently ate only bread and beer 4 days a week.
What?
Okay.
I mean that's college stuff.
Yeah.
Right. And so he that's how he lived for like 2 years, and apparently he was like, I'm going to go back to Italy where I'm welcome. And he wanted to settle down finally, but he became sick on the way and died in Germany in 1686.
Dang.
So that is the life of Nicolas Steno. But after his death, it gets a little interesting. And I actually learned a little bit about one of the various ways Catholicism works. So after his death, he was sent to Italy and buried near the family of that Grand Duke of Tuscany that had taken care of him. So he was buried with them for a couple hundred years. And basically right after his death, Steno was venerated as a saint by the Diocese of Hildesheim in Germany shortly.
That's a fun name.
It really is. That's the only reason I included it. And so apparently at some point, so like I said, that was very shortly after his death, I think like the same year. So that was 1686. Fast forward, among many things that the church changed in the past like 350 years, they changed how becoming a saint works. And so because the Diocese of Hildesheim made him a saint, that doesn't necessarily mean that like the entire Catholic Church as a whole recognizes him as a saint. So basically he was formally started in the process of becoming a saint in 1938, so 300 years after he was born. In 1988, he was either, I don't know how to pronounce this, whether it's just beatified or beatified, I don't know, by Pope John Paul II. And
I've heard of that guy.
Yeah, so he basically currently is 3/4 of the way to becoming a saint.
What's that last step?
I don't know. I didn't look that up.
Okay.
But I just know he's 3/4 of the way there. And so the beatification or beatification, that step is when you get the, I guess, prefix blessed. So that's why at the beginning I said the Blessed Nicolas Steno.
Wow.
And that, among many things that I'm sure that I left out, is the life and legacy of Nicolas Steno.
So it sounds like he was like all in all, like if we're especially grading on a curve here from the 1600s, like a reasonably cool dude.
Yeah, and it's like, yeah, grading historical figures by modern standards is just never going to end well for anybody involved.
Right, exactly. So, just again, grading on a curve here, if we're plucking some science dude from the 1600s, okay, I'll take this guy.
Yeah. And it's like, and to be fair, just for the sake of, transparency, the one guy that he like really cracked down and tried to ban all of his publications was Jewish. I didn't see anything that was why, but
it's
Oh.
it's a nope.
yeah.
It's one of those things that always seems to happen.
Again, and that was just me following Wikipedia rabbit holes. I didn't see any suggestion that was why, but given,
But
yeah, but
you know.
so the interesting life and legacy of Nicolas Steno. So that is going to wrap up my portion for this episode. But as we mentioned at the beginning, we have a new segment weekly. So it is time for Swamp Corner with Fia.
Hello. So
what is Swamp Corner? Like what the hell are we doing here?
I will get there.
Oh wow. Wow. I apologize, new co-host Fia. You will get there. Understood.
All right. Well, as you guys have heard, my name is Fia. If you've listened to the podcast a few episodes back,
Episode 34.
Oh yeah, guest starred. I live in southern Louisiana, and I'm a marine biologist. And so, because of this, I kind of wanted to do a little segment in the podcast. And Mike and Gavin were like, "Yeah, like we want you to come on and just do a little quick snippet of like swamp education, fun facts, swamp updates, etc. Just kind of." I'm still figuring it out exactly what it is that's going to be happening in the swamp corner, but it will be swamp related. In preparation of this, I've been watching a lot of Swamp People on Hulu, and that is my new guilty pleasure.
Oh, that's so fun. Also, just really quick. So I think that I had originally just even sort of sarcastically pitched it being called Swamp Corner.
Yeah.
And the reason I did that is so a couple of weeks ago we had like a game night with some friends, and we were trying to coordinate because we're coordinating across 3 time zones. And I think it was Mike was like, "Fia, what time is that swamp time?"
I don't remember this, but that absolutely sounds like something I would have said.
Oh yeah.
And yeah, so that's why I was like, "Oh, swamp. Fia equals swamp."
Thank you.
You are welcome. So with that context, what do we have for Swamp Corner today?
Yeah, so we're going to start off Swamp Corner with my favorite food of the South, and that is crawfish, aka in the North, crayfish, also called mudbugs, crawdads, or my personal favorite, crawdaddy.
Okay.
They are basically tiny lobsters, and they're related to lobsters. When I say they're basically tiny lobsters, I just mean they like physically look like lobsters, but at a much smaller scale. In some way or another, they are related to lobsters, but crawfish live in fresh waters. So in the swamps, they like to live. They also have a wide geographic range in freshwater rivers, swamps, North America, New Zealand, Australia. But in Louisiana, they are most prevalent in the swampy areas and in ditches and paddy fields, which are basically like flooded layer of dirt. It's like a really big puddle, is how I would describe it.
Yeah, like I always hear of like rice patties. I'm sure that's
Yes,
like
yes.
similar.
Yeah, they actually do like in Louisiana they have like a rotating crop system
Oh, okay.
of like rice paddies during some portion of the year and then crawfish during another time of the year. And then I think sometimes they rotate in soybeans too.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, the crawfish like industry, you see a lot with like the paddy fields and rice too.
Cool.
Hmm.
Yeah, so there are 330 species of crawfish in the US, and 39 of them are in Louisiana.
See,
Um,
that's something that I kind of hate about invertebrates. Is just like,
there's
yeah,
so many.
I get it. You're diverse. Like you you don't have to rub it in. Like I get it.
Yeah, and that's just in the US too. Like, they're everywhere. But,
You can you can eat them, right? Like I have seen like people hiking just go like pick up
oh, yeah.
crawdads and like I don't know if you have to do you have to boil them or can you just like pluck them out and eat them?
Well, it depends how gutsy you are. Uh,
Yeah.
I think really you can eat anything raw if you'd like, but you might get sick.
But yeah, that's not the
Yeah.
question I was asking. But
No,
okay.
I think yeah, crustaceans in
No,
general seem to have a lot of well,
they're
pretty much
disgusting.
yeah, pretty much any wild animal will have parasites.
Yeah,
So it's like
yeah,
eating anything just straight out of the wild without cooking. It's just generally not a good idea.
yeah. Don't
Okay.
listen to me. Although I have had, so I work with oysters a lot in my field, and one time we were like checking on some oysters, and one of my lab mates just cracked open one and slurped it up, and just like looked me straight in the eye while doing it, and I was like, "This is not,
Establishing dominance.
this is not for me."
um, are they from Louisiana?
Yeah,
Okay, makes sense.
yeah, yeah. Um, but I don't know if that defines the guts of what who will eat a raw oyster like that. But anyways, back to the crawfish. The main harvested species of crawfish are the red swamp crawfish and the southern white river crawfish. And you eat a crawfish mostly for its tail. So just like with a lobster, you would eat its tail. And then if the crawfish are big enough, you can eat the claw meat, but not a lot of people really try to go for that. Um, I do because claw meat is delicious and I don't want to be wasteful. But
The claw.
the claw, yeah.
Great
And you get some
reference.
really big ones sometimes that like you can actually get like a good chunk out of. So some ways of preparing it, Mike. This is for you.
Oh boy.
Uh, Crawfish boil, and that is essentially just a large pot of boiling crawfish.
Hmm.
But you mix it with seafood seasoning, and you throw a bunch of vegetables in there, sausage, potatoes, corn, and you let it all soak in the juices, and it's very delicious. Um, so when you get a crawfish boil, uh, you usually like twist the head apart from the tail, and then you just like pull apart the tail outsides to get the meat on the inside. But there's also crawfish etouffee, which is like a Cajun or Creole, I'm not really sure, dish of seasonings and sauce, and crawfish and rice. Crawfish fettuccine, that's a really good one. I have enjoyed that. Crawfish cakes, pretty much anything like seafood style you can do. You can just use crawfish as like a
Okay.
substitute.
As the base. Okay.
Yeah, yeah. Um, Culturally, crawfish are really important for parties, families, festival gatherings, um, and it's a big like community thing to have like a crawfish boil or not necessarily like at a community level, but like even within your family or just friends, to do that. And it's almost like a barbecue, I would say, like in terms of like how it is like an activity for like people to come together.
Is this strictly an American phenomenon, or do we see them everywhere or in other
Crawfish
places?
boils or crawfish?
Both.
Crawfish, you pretty much can find everywhere except for like
Right.
the tropics.
Hmm.
But I don't really know too much about crawfish cuisine other than in Louisiana.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
So if
I
you're
just
out there
know,
listening somewhere and you're
yeah.
not in Louisiana and crawfish are a big part of your culture, let us know. We'd love to hear about it.
Yes,
Leave
definitely.
us a voice message, perhaps.
Please do.
Yes.
It might take us a while for us to actually see it, but at some point it'll come up.
Yeah.
All
So
right. Does that
on the
wrap up our
opposite,
inaugural
oh
swamp
no,
corner?
sorry, I have one more thing. On
Okay.
the
Please do.
opposite
No, you're
end
good.
of, okay, cool. On the opposite end of, do they eat crawfish in other places? I would say that in New York, like upstate New York, there's crawfish there, and you can eat them. And
Oh
if you
yeah,
find
I
them, you can
caught
eat them.
them. I caught them as a kid.
Right, right. But I don't know too many people that do that like you see in Louisiana. Like here, it's a major like harvesting industry. So, Mike, if you'd like to go outside and catch some crawfish for us,
I
let us know.
I may have to do that. I think I've mentioned this once or twice on the podcast before, but I as a kid did not go catching crawfish. I only recently discovered the outdoors existed within the last
Ah,
few years. And I'll tell you what, I'm enjoying the hell out of it. And so at some point, that's part of why I asked, is because I knew crawfish were a thing. And I
mm,
just wasn't sure. I wasn't sure how risky you could get when it came to eating crawfish. So
yeah. I mean, as
at
long
some
as you
point,
boil them.
fair enough. I
I mean,
will go ahead, Gavin.
I would offer to go out and catch them here, but there's no water in California, so.
Oh,
Oh,
oh.
boom, roasted, literally. All right. So on that note, thank
Wait,
you,
I
Fia,
have a
for.
question. I have a question.
Oh man, I was all set through the outro.
I know. I'm sorry.
Man, all right, ask your question.
So,
I'm sure it's important.
in one of the best movies ever made, Forrest Gump,
Of
is
course, Forrest
the
Gump.
the shrimp that Bubba wants to go catch. Those are like shrimp, not
Yeah,
cra- I would call them crayfish. I'm from the north. I call them crayfish, but
yeah. I once did call them crayfish, and now I do not, because I seem silly if I
those are
do.
the same.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Oh wait, no, I'm sorry. Like, from the movie, no, he is in
Okay.
like the shrimping business, and like shrimping down here is a whole other thing.
Okay.
Like shrimping, huge industry down here, apart from crawfish.
Okay.
So he does mean shrimp.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
All right. Do you have any other last minute shrimpy or crayfishy crawdaddy facts for us?
Uh, no, I think that's good. Just if any of the pod fans out there want me to talk about something specifically about swamp things, or Louisiana things, leave a message to the podcast somewhere, and I'd be happy to talk about it.
Yeah.
Wonderful, and we would be happy to talk about it as well here on the podcast. But this has been episode 67 of I Wish You Were Dead, a podcast about things that used to be alive. My name is Mike. That is Gavin, and Fia is now with us regularly. Thank you, everybody, and we will see you all next week.